Welcome to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. I'm DT Kane, author of the epic fantasy series The Aggersfar Saga and the spoken books Uprising. Each week, I read from one of my novels, discuss my writing process, answer your questions, and have general discussions about fantasy fiction. It's like a book club, except I do all the work for you. Find show notes, info about all my novels, and much more at dtkane.com. Here's the show. Chapter 23. If anything, the healed version of Deliritous was even harder to deal with than the injured one. The dragon hadn't been joking about him needing rest. Deliritous was so lost to sleep that Baz would have thought him dead if not for the occasional rise and fall of his chest. Moving him was like dragging an overstuffed sack of potatoes. Even Rox had a difficult time of it, caught between a desire to get him to safety and to be as gentle with him as possible. Eventually, they managed to get him onto Eromer's back. They'd have to leave the horses, though Eromer said he would return for the creatures. He seemed to have a soft spot for the beasts, and became quite angry when Baz had suggested killing them, rather than let them roam to their deaths in the Firelands. Before leaving, Baz strapped the saddlebags to each of the dragon's sizable forearms. Rox was already on Eromer's back, holding Deliritous, so Baz strapped the bookpack onto his own back. He eyed Eromer with silent consternation for several moments before sighing and pulling himself up onto the book dragon's back behind Rox. Eromer's spine was too broad to straddle like a horse, so Baz just sat with his legs stretched out before him, grabbing tightly to the tufts of fur that lined the dragon's back. As soon as Baz had secured himself, the dragon bent its knees, preparing to take flight. Baz shut his eyes and squeezed at his handholds until his fingers ached, waiting for the inevitable lurch of gravity that would threaten to knock him from his seat. It didn't come. Eventually, Baz opened his eyes, thinking he must have misjudged the dragon's movement and that it hadn't yet taken off. Shock caused him to nearly lose his grip on the dragon's fur. They were hundreds of feet over the Firelands, drifting through the air as smoothly as a schooner gliding over open water on a clear day. Baz redoubled his grip and fought between competing sentiments of abject terror and a hungry need to take in the amazing sights around him. They headed east, the marsh of the Firelands stretching in every direction. Looking south, he could just make out the inkwell and the charred stumps of the reach beyond. They had been there just a couple days before, but it seemed years. "Look!" Rox yelled, pointing north. Baz followed the man's pointing finger to see a stone tower jutting just over the horizon, what remained of the great library of Tome, their destination. It was difficult to comprehend. Of course, Baz had always known that the ruins of the once great city existed, but it was always spoken of as a thing of the distant past, a time long gone. Seeing it in person, if only from a great distance, put a sense of awe in Baz's belly that was at once exhilarating and nausea-inducing, for he knew he'd soon be headed there and facing the dangers it held. It also meant that, one way or another, this journey was coming to an end, and that meant facing the reality that a reader of erstwhile knew that he was a cuss. Maybe Deliritous had proved to be not quite as bad as Baz had always thought, but he still worried over what the Torchsire heir would do once he was no longer dependent on Baz to complete the trials. Baz tried to put such thoughts out of his head, completely unproductive. He wouldn't run. He couldn't leave Tax behind. and as much as it rankled him, deep down he knew that he owed it to Deliritous now. The Torchsire heir had saved his life when it would have been much easier, even understandable, for him to just stand by and watch Hellar cook him to a crisp. Rox might not think the oath Baz had made enforceable under his Enigman code of truth, but Baz had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. As they continued to fly east, Baz noticed something unexpected below them. There were pockets of greenery, not many and not large, but dotted here and there across the landscape were little bastions of uncorrupted grass and trees that had somehow avoided succumbing to the all-consuming swamp that surrounded them. "The homes of my kin, Eromer said, as if reading Baz's mind. "Your kin?" Baz repeated in surprise. "Yes," Eromer replied, voice growing sad. "I know there are not many, fewer each year. But we do what we can to keep the power of the scribes alive. The one part of my oath to them I can still fulfill. Baz tried to picture more than one book dragon in the same place and couldn't, shaking his head in wonder. It was like stepping back into an age of myth, one where all the world's wonders hadn't been lost to the burning. What might the world he knew be like if these creatures went forth into it, rather than residing like hermits in their time capsules of an era long past, lamenting a failed oath? But Baz could relate. After all, he hadn't wanted to leave Torchsire Library, and surely the book dragon's sanctuaries were nicer than that. A frown crept onto Baz's face. Why did that thought make him feel guilty? These book dragons might actually be able to make a difference, but what could he do other than ensure that he kept breathing? Not long after, Eromer began to descend, touching down on a patch of green that seemed somewhat larger than the others they'd passed over. If not for the sky's reddish tinge, it would have been impossible to say they were deep within the Firelands, as the area looked like any lush clearing one might find in the woods immediately surrounding erstwhile. The noticeable absence of the constant sludgy slushing of the Firelands caused Baz to pick at his ears. After having grown so accustomed to the noise, it seemed wrong not to hear it. Large oaks were scattered about the clearing, ordinary squirrels and chipmunks jumping through the branches. A family of deer grazed off in the distance, and the horses, dozens of them, galloping about the green, open spaces, or munching from hay racks that hung from trees or wooden fences scattered about the grounds. The air smelled fresh, wholesome, like this clearing was a stronghold of truth within a sea of lies. As Baz dismounted and helped Rox lower Deliritous to the ground, the largest dog Baz had ever seen trotted over to the dragon and licked its giant face. It was all black, save for white around its paws and muzzle. Baz could have easily ridden it like a small horse. "Good boy, Novel. Good boy," Eromer said to the mutt, reaching out a paw and patting the dog gently on the head. After accepting the dragon's praise, the dog turned a wary eye toward Baz and Rox, the beginnings of a growl thundering deep in its throat. "They are friends, the dragon assured the dog. It gave them another wary glance, then lumbered a short distance away and lay down, though its eyes continued to watch them. "There's so much, life here," Baz said as the dragon faced them. Eromer seemed to frown. Though his face couldn't really move into such an expression, The downward twitch of his mustaches and dropping of eyebrows gave a fair impression of displeasure. "I see how one young as you might think as much. But this is the merest fraction of what this land used to be. Come, we'll take your friend to my cave so he can rest properly. The cave was not far from where they'd landed, a wide opening between a rock formation at the center of the clearing. The entrance glowed with an inviting white light that seemed to beckon Baz on. As he approached the entrance, he saw that it was illuminated by glass spheres resembling the lamps in Liana's workshop, except these floated in the air, hovering not unlike how Eromer flew through the air. Each was like a tiny sun, together lighting the cave just as if it were outdoors at high noon. But the inexplicable light fixtures barely even registered with Baz, for the cave's interior, which was large enough for the dragon to move about with ease, was lined from floor to ceiling with bookshelves. Full bookshelves. More books than were likely possessed by all the libraries of erstwhile combined, even counting the trove of books owned by Xavier. Banners decorated what little wall space there was, not covered by shelving, deep blue, edged in gold, with a book and feathered quill stitched at the center, the lost sigil of Tome. Several man-sized reading tables and chairs were pushed to the back of the cave, obviously of no use to the dragon, though they appeared to have been impeccably maintained. Baz could find no words for quite some time, and even Rox seemed shocked at the unthinkable display of wealth and power. If anyone knew this trove existed. "Eromer," Baz finally stammered out, "where did you get all these books?" The dragon's eyes roved sadly over the shelves. "It is what little I was able to save from the great library before the shelves fell. So little of so vast a collection. Please, don't make me speak further of it. It grows dark soon, and I must see to my animals. There is human bedding at the back of the cave. Lay your friend down to rest. With that, the book dragon turned and began to leave the cave. "Eromer?" Baz said, mind finally punching through the shocked haze that the book dragon's lair had caused. "You wouldn't, happen to be willing to let us take one of these books, would you?" The book dragon stopped moving for a moment, then spoke without looking back. "They are not mine to give, young orator. I merely hold them until he who writes returns to claim them. "He who writes?" Eromer sighed, glancing back at them. "You really know very little, though perhaps I am unfair to one so young. Knowledge takes many years to acquire. He who writes is Pront V. Lextor, librarian of Tome, prefect of salts, keeper of the inks, protector of the sheafs. This was his home once. He walked these very grounds, wearing his robes of elemental colors, wrote at the tables in this very cave. Baz felt his mouth hanging open once more, a common occurrence that day. When he said nothing, Eromer seemed to take it to mean Baz had no more questions and left the cave. Of course, Baz had an infinite number of questions for the book dragon. He just couldn't process what Eromer had said quickly enough to select a single one to ask. Finally, he turned to Rox and murmured, "He was talking about the Enigma himself, Rox. Eromer knew him? The most powerful of the 3 scribes? Rox only shrugged, as if he heard such things on a daily basis, heading deeper into the cave and laying Deliritous on a feather mattress he found there. There was a folded pile of bedding beside the mattress. Somewhere at the back of Baz's mind, he wondered how Eromer managed to fold sheets with his giant paws. Rox carefully wrapped a sheet around Deliritus's sleeping body, taking care to tuck the fabric beneath his chin before standing and giving a great stretch. Then the Harbour unstrapped his mask, letting out a small sigh of satisfaction, and sat at one of the tables at the cave's back. For want of anything better to do, Baz joined the large man. You really believe what Eromer says, Rox? That he's older than the burning? Seems impossible to me. Illumined ones honor the truth, Rox said. They followed the founder of my home city. They have the same values as Enigmans. Eromer does not lie. His words mean what they mean. Baz said, plopping onto a chair at the same table as Rox. I suppose you'd know more about that than me, but maybe he's giving us the old double meaning. We hear one thing when the words really mean something else? Rox shook his head. What reason does he have to deceive? And he is clearly one who suffers the symptoms of a broken oath. How do you figure that? This whole place, Rox said, motioning around at the cave, and the animals he cares for. He seeks to recompense for an oath failed. It is the only way to find truth after you have lied, by fulfilling a greater oath. Though if Eromer's oath was as great as he says, a sufficient recompense will be difficult indeed. Baz scoffed. Sounds arrogant to me, thinking that he was responsible for the loss of Tome. Eromer said himself he was young, for a dragon anyway, at the time it occurred. He can't have been solely responsible. Seems overblown to still be making amends after all this time. Oaths are serious things, Rox growled. Baz raised his arms into the air. Not saying they're not. But just because the purpose of an oath is extinguished doesn't mean you're responsible, does it? What if Deliritous died in his sleep from a disease? Would you be a liar? Of course not. Totally out of your control. No causation linking you to his demise. Rox scratched at the unshaved stubble along his jaw. When you truly devote yourself to a truth, Rox finally said, you feel blame for its loss, no matter the cause, he finally said. That's no answer, Baz said. Guilting yourself for something outside your control doesn't create any true responsibility for the loss. That's a lie. Rox huffed a contemplative sigh. Have you never suffered a failure that troubled you deeply, even though it was out of your hands? Baz trailed off. That terrible day, 10 years past, came to his mind, vivid as if it had just happened yesterday. If Baz could just have kept his mouth shut, maybe Tax would have talked his way out of the situation, wouldn't be retired, and Baz wouldn't feel. I wish you to know I am sorry, Rox said. Baz looked away from the Harbour. No, Rox, don't. The large man continued as if he hadn't heard. It is the only thing I've ever done since I was old enough to understand truth that I worry was a lie. I was younger then, and thought Deliritus right, that Yeltax had to be dealt with for Deliritus's protection. Rox looked down at his hands. I still think it was consistent with my oath, but I do worry, and I am sorry for what it did to you. You can't possibly understand, Baz said, eyes to the floor, blinking furiously. Rox remained quiet for some time, giving Baz time to get a hold of himself. Finally, the Harbour said, I lost family once too. I was young when Deliritus's father acquired me. I had a mother and a sister, Alexa Stonebinder. She cried when they took me away, and I promised her that I would return one day. Ever since, my oath to protect Deliritus is all I've known, but someday I will fulfill that vow to my sister." "Oh," Baz said. He'd never actually taken the time to think on it, but Rox, too, was a slave, just as Baz was. A slave with his own tragic past, and some reason, at least, to not be entirely loyal to Torchsire. He wasn't just some mindless dog. "Well," Baz said, "I don't forgive you for tax, but maybe you're a bit less of a lout than I thought." Rox chuckled, a sound not unlike a distant earthquake. "But," Baz continued, "we're not friends." That cut the Harbour's mirth short. "We're going to do this thing for Deliritous, Rox. Together. I owe it to him as much as it burns my soul to admit it. We'll go to Tome and get that book, and you'll keep me safe because Deliritous is depending on me." Rox nodded gravely. "But what about after? When I turn the book over to Deliritous and we return to Erstwhile, and he decides to turn me into his father as a cuss. What then?" "Deliritus swore he would not do that," Rox said, as if personally offended. Baz shut his eyes, leaning his head against the back of the chair. Is he more dedicated to the truth or to his father? Baz opened his eyes to see Rox regarding him with a cold stare, but the Harbour offered no reply. "Don't take it personal, Rox. Deliritus is a product of his environment, and I know at the end of the day you'll have to support him. I won't take that personally, but friendship under such circumstances is a fanciful dream." Rox continued to glower at him without speaking, making Baz squirm in his seat. "Come on," Baz said in a light-hearted tone. "Let's cook up some food and get some sleep. We're going to Tome tomorrow." He stood and headed out of the cave to start a fire. Rox followed, though Baz could feel the man's glare on his back the entire way. It unsettled Baz, knowing the Harbour actually had a heart beneath that killer's exterior, and even more disconcerting, that Rox could actually relate to Baz, maybe even understand him. Baz just hoped Rox didn't understand him too well. All right, friends, welcome back to D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Today is Sunday, May 8th, 2022, as I record this, which is episode 17 of the book club. Big personal update for me this week is I ran my half marathon yesterday that I've been talking about over the past couple of months. The Ellicottville Happy Half, for those wondering. Ellicottville, or Eville, as the locals call it, is a nice ski resort community about 40 minutes outside of Buffalo, New York, and being a ski town, not quite as flat as I might have liked for running, but I still reached my goal, if just barely. Was aiming to complete the race in 2:10 and crossed the line in a blistering 2:09:58. So there you go. The training paid off. A couple of big hills there really got me toward the end of the race. If you're a runner, you know how disheartening it can be to run into a big hill at the very end of a race. But still managed to pull it out, and some lessons learned for my next race here. I was certainly gassed by the end. Had to kind of just collapse to the ground for a few minutes as soon as I crossed the finish line. But got a nice big chocolate chip muffin into me, and some water, and I was good to go for the rest of the day. My legs are still still a little sore, but I'll go on a walk later and stretch them out. So right, for those of you who read the weekly newsletter, which you can sign up for at dtkane.com. You'll know that I like to compare running to writing, since they're both kind of endurance sports, or at least endurance activities. And persistence really pays off in both of them, so I like how they complement one another and kind of analogize both. So it works well in my routine. Plus, running is good exercise and a good way to get outside, though sometimes it can be tough to get out there when it's freezing cold out, like it's been for the past few months. But weather seems to be finally turning around here. Other than running, I'm continuing to work on part 4 of the Spoken Books Uprising. I'm in the home stretch of that now. I started working on the finale section, really part 3 of the book, but probably like the last 20,000 words, I would guess. So I should have my first draft done by May 20th. That's the goal here. So 12 days from now, I've got a decent amount of writing I need to get done, but hopefully I'll power through it here, because I am going to be out of the country starting May 21st for 2 whole weeks. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the episode here. But for now, why don't we hop into our analysis of chapter 23 here. All right. He wouldn't run. That's our first heading here. So Baz and company fly away on Eromer, the book dragon here. He's definitely got some strong magic going on. He's got no wings, and Baz can't even tell when they've lifted off the ground. Well, partly because he has his eyes shut, but he also doesn't feel it. And, before he knows it, they are flying over the Firelands, soaring over them. Better verb there, right? Soaring. And there are a few interesting sights to take in. First, we get our first glimpse of Tome, the spire of the great library poking over the horizon. Awe, exhilaration, nausea. It's certainly a very Baz thing to say here, combining those things. Though, to be fair, his emotions are kind of certainly running the gamut here at this point. It is an amazing sight, seeing something that Baz has ever really only heard spoken of as a historic relic. But it also marks the approaching end of the journey here, right? This tower is a symbol in more than one way, certainly the culmination of what we've been building up to here thus far. And seeing it really drives that reality home for Baz. He's going to have to go face the dangers of the ruins there, the cityless, who apparently dwell in and around Tome. And then after that, he has to worry over what Deliritous is going to do to him once the trials are done. So he's got that worry at the back of his mind. But Baz also finally admits outright to us that he owes it to Deliritous to finish the trials for him. Acknowledges that it would have been easier and maybe even understandable if Deliritous hadn't saved him from that fire breather that Hellar had mind controlled. So Baz is maybe finally letting his guard down here just a little bit. It took certainly an extreme event for that to happen, but isn't that the case with a lot of things? It's easy to ignore problems until something really serious happens that prevents you from ignoring it any further or any longer, and that's that seems to be what happened here with Baz. Took Deliritous almost dying for him to grasp that. Maybe I've been a little too hard on him. The other notable sights as we're flying over the Firelands on Eromer's back are these pockets of greenery spotted across the otherwise desolate landscape. Remember, the Firelands are just like a big swampy bog, and Baz is surprised to see little, what does he call them? Little bastions of uncorrupted grass and trees that had somehow avoided succumbing to the all-consuming swamp that surrounded them. And so what are these? They're book dragon dens, Eromer tells us. So there's more than just Eromer. There's lots more book dragons, it seems. Though he does note there are fewer each year, and what's happening to them? Not clear at this point, but Eromer does say, there's, a few of them die off. each year. Is it old age? Is something else killing them? We don't know. But regardless, Eromer tells us they're doing what they can to, quote, keep the power of the scribes alive. What does that mean? Well, hold that thought for a second. I think it doesn't come right out and say it in the text, but you'll see in a minute, I think, what that means. But first, comfort. That is the next little section of analysis I've labeled here. Baz gets a little surly for a moment, not a totally uncommon occurrence for him, to be sure, but happens here. He gets to thinking, how might the world be different if the book dragons actually went into the world instead of hiding in the Firelands, lamenting a failed oath? But then he realized he's not unlike the book dragons in that regard. He didn't want to leave his home either, despite not really liking it. And this bothers Baz, so he can't really put his finger on quite why. But this is sort of a hidden big moment for him. Maybe it's not quite apparent upon first reading, but it's the first time that Baz actually realizes it's maybe not right to just sit around in comfort when there is good to be done out in the world. He's sort of looking down on the book dragons, who are obviously very powerful creatures, but they're just sitting around while the world kind of has a bunch of injustices. But they are not doing anything to stop that. And I think this is an interesting concept that I find particularly important, both in my both theoretically and in my actual daily life. The question: do we live for comfort, or do we live to chase our dreams and do something meaningful, which often involves at least a bit of discomfort? It's an interesting idea, right? We like curling up on the couch with Netflix on the night or at night after we've done a hard day's work. But is that what we actually want our life to be? Because what we do each day, is our life, right? that at once sounds obvious, but is also kind of troubling if you realize maybe you're not spending your valuable time quite as you should be to achieve what you actually want to achieve. I actually have a post-it note on my monitor here that says, and cover your ears, young children out there, if anyone's listening, but fuck comfort. But the post-it note says, helps remind me to not get complacent. Chasing what you actually want in life can sometimes be uncomfortable, but you got to embrace that discomfort if you want to get to be where you want to be. And then, so just I'll take off my philosophy cardigan here, again, metaphorically speaking, this time. But getting back to the story here, Baz is finally realizing, well, if I'm gonna throw shade on the book dragons for hiding in their little holes, maybe I can't just be obsessed with staying breathing, and that's my only concern. If there's something else that I can, if I can do that's worthwhile. All right, OMG books. Our next section here. So we land in Eromer's clearing, and it's like an oasis, even bigger than the other sanctuaries Baz saw from the sky, which I suppose that suggests something about Eromer, right? Why is he the book dragon with the biggest lair, even though he was so young at the time of the burning? He's even got a bunch of animals: squirrels, chipmunks, deer, and horses, and a giant dog, Novel the dog. Of course, a book dragon has a dog named Novel, right? But despite all that, Baz is kind of amazed. It kind of seems like they're in the center of this desolate landscape, but this is a little slice of normal, or even more beautiful than normal landscape here. But Eromer is still depressed when Baz comments on all the life in the clearing. This is the merest fraction of what this land used to be. So Eromer is so old, he remembers before the Firelands were the Firelands, right? When they were a green a green oasis of hot springs. Baz told us a few chapters ago that's what the Firelands were like before the burning. So we move on to Eromer's house, or at least house in quotes. It's really a giant cave. Glass spheres hovering in mid-air supply the light, which you would probably think ordinarily is quite the sight, right? Just these big glass baubles hanging in the air with nothing holding them up, apparently. But Baz barely notices those because the cave is full of bookshelves, and all of them are full of spoken books. You know, they're packed in there. More books than in all of erstwhile, Baz says. And I guess this is hinting at keeping the scribe's power alive, like Eromer said earlier. He calls these books what little I was able to save from the great library before the shelves fell. So little of so vast a collection. Driving home the point that spoken books, they weren't always as rare as they are today, right? Many were destroyed during the burning, and remember, others were destroyed by Deliritous' ancestor during the second burning. Remember, Acktus Torchsire, he kind of led this crusade to collect all the books and consolidate them with just the readers. But he destroyed a lot of them too to keep them out of the hands of ordinary folks. So, Eromer seems to be, he's holding on to these books, and he kind of hints that he's expecting the scribes to come back one day, which is interesting. Is that superstition, or does he have more reason to believe that? We don't really get into that more here. Well, maybe just a little. We do get into it. For an instant, Baz sees all these books and he sees a way out, right? Way out of going to Tome. Eromer, could I have one of these books? Just give me one and I can go home. But Eromer says he can't have any of the books because they aren't his to give. He's just looking after them until he who writes returns to claim them. He who writes, who is that? Well, it's Pront v. Lextor, the Enigma, of course. Well, maybe not of course, but that's what Eromer tells us. Of course, this shocks Baz, since Eromer is talking like he knew the man. And this is kind of the final evidence for last week's quest, where I asked you the name of the book dragon in the prologue. I told you that was Eromer in the prologue. He is holding on to books he personally saved from Tome. And he says, at least he implies that he knew the Enigma, so more strong evidence here that the book dragon and the prologue and Eromer are one. And he is the same dragon from the prologue. And, again, he is holding on to these books until he who writes returns to claim them. So didn't the scribes all die during the burning? Maybe it seems Eromer maybe doesn't think so. So, let's not forget that, because that's certainly going to be significant later on here. Just real quick, Rox also notes, I think I alluded to this previously, but this might actually be the first time the text comes right out and says it, but the book dragons were followers of the Enigma, which is why Enigmans worship them. The Enigma founded Enigma City. That's where Rox is from, and the book dragons were disciples of the Enigma. They do not tell lies, just like Rox and his people. So that's why Rox was kind of treating Eromer like some holy figure when they found him there last week. All right, and then our last section here, which is kind of a lengthy discussion, but lengthy because a lot of deep stuff going on here. I wish you to know I am sorry. So now we get back into some philosophy. Everyone put your cardigans back on here. Rox notes that Eromer is suffering from the symptoms of a broken oath. That's why he has all the animals. He's trying to, make up for his failure by caring for all of them. What does Rox tell us here? It is the only way to find truth after you have lied, by fulfilling a greater oath. Remember at the beginning of the chapter, we find out that Eromer was actually angry, and Baz suggested killing the horses. Baz is like, well, we're just going to leave them out here to die in the Firelands. Maybe we should just put them out of their misery. But Eromer says he's going to go back and rescue them later. So Eromer is trying to make up for what he views as his failure in permitting the Great Library to fall, which starts an interesting discussion here. Baz says that's kind of arrogant of Eromer, thinking he alone is to blame for the burning. He was young. Surely he wasn't solely responsible. Is an oath broken just because its cause is extinguished? Baz argues, no. Not K-N-O-W, but N-O, no. Baz argues the answer to that is no. If there's no causal link between your actions and the end of an oath, then, you didn't break your oath, right? If Deliritous died in his sleep from a disease, would Rox be guilty of breaking his oath? Baz says no, but Rox says when you truly devote yourself to an oath, you feel blame for its loss, no matter the cause. Of course, Baz shoots back, guilting yourself for something outside your control doesn't create actual responsibility for the loss, Rox. Come on, that's a lie. Have you never suffered a failure that troubled you deeply, even though it was out of your hands? Rox says. And of course Baz has. He's been in this position before with his brother. And we really see some of Baz's, regret and the guilt that he is carrying about with him all these years later. If only Baz had kept his mouth shut all those years ago, maybe Tax wouldn't have been retired. Remember, Tax was kind of trying to talk his way out of that book being found in the speaking room all those years ago, and then Baz kind of just blurted out, oh, he wasn't going to hurt anyone. And that kind of sealed the Tax's fate. So all those years later, Baz still remembers, if I could have just kept my mouth shut, maybe Tax could have talked his way out of that mess. But it's interesting. Unlike our philosophical discussion, was that 2 weeks? I think that was 2 weeks ago now, where I actually put on the cardigan. I'm not sure Baz and Rox are really arguing here. Rox doesn't necessarily disagree with Baz's point about actual responsibility. Really what they're debating is whether it's right, right in quotes, right to feel guilt over a failed promise that was out of your control. And it's a little bit of a paradox here, I think. The logical answer seems no. If you couldn't have done anything, why feel bad? But, the paradox here is, if you're truly dedicated to a cause, how could you not feel bad about it failing? Because if you didn't feel bad, wouldn't that suggest there's some dishonesty in how dedicated you were to the cause? Because how could you not feel bad if you wanted it, if you wanted to see it through and it failed? So is the logical path here actually a sign of dishonesty in this instance? Interesting. It's circular. Is it right to feel the guilt or not? I'm not sure I have a straight answer here, but just trying to be a little thought-provoking. Of course, then, Rox is like a mind reader here. He knows Baz is thinking of his brother, and Rox just comes out and apologizes for hurting Tax. Maybe didn't quite see this coming. But, Rox, if we didn't love him already, we love him now, right? He's got regret over what he did to Baz's brother. He actually worries it wasn't consistent with his oath. Was Deliritous truly endangered by Tax? You even hear Rox is trying to reassure himself that I still think it was consistent with my oath, but I worry. Baz, of course, says, you can't possibly understand what it was like to lose a brother, Rox. But our giant teddy bear killer here surprises us once again, saying, he has lost family too. Rox has his own backstory. When Deliritous' father acquired him, him being Rox, he left behind a sister, Adalexa Stonebinder was her name, or I suppose is her name. Presumably she's still alive. And he has sworn an oath. That one day he will return to her. And this is kind of a big tidbit here too. A huge bit of news. Rox has actually sworn another oath that's potentially conflicting with his promise to Deliritous. And he, it certainly seems he was brought into the Torchsire's service against his will. When they took me away, he says. So interesting. Rox, maybe some mixed motivations here toward Deliritous' family. And, this isn't going to become hugely relevant in the rest of this book, but certainly this isn't the last you're going to hear of Rox's estranged sister, and it's certainly interesting in any event to kind of get a little glimpse into the kind of the tragic past of Rox here. So Baz and Rox kind of connect here for a moment over their past losses, but of course Baz cannot let this nice moment last. Maybe you're a bit less of a lout than I thought, and Rox chuckles at that, but we're not friends. What happens when we get back to the trials, Rox? Or get back from the trials, Rox, and Deliritous wants to turn me in for a cuss. And Rox gets defensive. Deliritous wouldn't go back on an oath. He said he wasn't going to do that. But Baz then asks whether Deliritous is more dedicated to the truth or his father. And, of course, Rox does not answer that, which is its own answer, really. If Deliritous thinks it'll please his father, is he going to err on the side of keeping his oath or pleasing his father? And we've seen that despite how, perhaps uncaring Deliritous' father is, he is certainly looking to make the man proud. So Baz recognizes his wow, really stuttered on that. Baz recognizes this, and so does Rox. So it's kind of hard for them to become friends or even really allies, except out of necessity here, when Baz knows that Rox is ultimately going to side with Deliritous, which could be quite detrimental to Baz. Though even here, there's a kind of a funny little thing, because even though Baz is throwing Rox's effort at bridging the divide between them back in his face, Baz still shows some growth here. He doesn't really blame Rox or Deliritous. It's not like he's angry here. He's just sort of resigned. Deliritous is just a product of his environment. Remember, his brother said this back in the beginning of the book. He was echoing what Tax said. Baz seems to have finally adopted maybe a little bit more of a mature attitude. First, we saw at the beginning of this chapter, finally admitting that he owes his life to Deliritous, and thus he's going to finish the trials, and now noting here, Deliritous might be part of this upper echelon of the slave-holding society, but, he was born into this. Generations of people before him have done this. He is a product of his environment. I can't necessarily get mad at him. What did Baz say earlier? It'd be like getting mad at a cow for chewing cud. It's just what they do. Doesn't make it right, but also, it's an interesting paradox here. That's really all Del has ever known. But still, him and Rox really can't be friends when they both know that at the end of the day, Rox could end up supporting Del, ordering Baz to be executed for a cuss. Even though Baz silently admits to himself that Rox has a heart beneath his killer's exterior, and that maybe Rox even understands him better than anyone else Baz knows, because, Rox has this tragic backstory we learn with the loss of a close family member. So certainly lots of tension here. Baz's life view can no longer be so simple as just hating Deliritous and Rox for what they did to Tax. People are more complicated than a single act that they may have taken, no matter how bad that action was. And Baz is beginning to come to grips with that reality. And that ends chapter 23 here. All right, so like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, I'm going into vacation mode here for the next few weeks. Taking a 2-week trip to to Europe starting on May 20th, 2022, or the 21st, actually. But never fear, you're still going to get an episode each week, but they're going to be a bit shorter because I only have so much time to record. I really need to record like 4 episodes in the week before I leave to make sure we've got enough for them to keep coming out each Monday. So next week, which is episode 18, will be just chapter 24. I'm not going to do any analysis after that. And then the same for the following week, episode 19 will be just chapter 25. And then episode 20 will then, there will be no new reading of the novel that week. It'll just be my discussion of chapters 24 and 25. Then episode 21 will be chapter 26, which is a pretty short chapter, and my analysis, so kind of back to a usual format, though that will be a short episode. And then by then I will be fully back into the swing of things, back from vacation. And that's all going to be leading up to a very significant and very long chapter 27. So that's going to be a bit of a marathon episode for when I get back. So you'll have that to look forward to. But there you go, so you are all just aware of what the episode lineup is going to look like here for the next few weeks. And then that leaves us just with our quote of the week to wrap it up here. And this week's quote is from Joe Abercrombie in his wonderful novel, The Blade itself. The more you learn, the more you realize how little you know. Still, the struggle itself is worthwhile. Knowledge is the root of power, after all. And I wrote a few words about this in the newsletter this week. Being told to, quote, enjoy the journey is an overused cliche. But cliches tend to be cliches for a reason. There's truth buried in them. It's easy to become obsessed with the next thing, and the next thing after that, and so on ad infinitum. But what is living if not the present moment? That's all we have. The past is gone, and the future never guaranteed. So stop and smell the roses, or feel the sunshine on your face, or actually taste that morning coffee. Embrace the present and take power back from the stress of life, the stresses of life. So there you go, our quote of the week and my little essay to go along with it. And it's a nice day out here today, so I think I'm going to go feel some sunshine on my face now. So as always, thank you for listening out there. And until next time, this has been D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. What might the world he knew be like if these creatures went forth into it, rather than residing like hermits in their time capsules? Capsules? The time capsules. Ugh. Thanks for listening to D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. If you liked today's episode, please consider rating and reviewing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and hit that subscribe button and the bell so you get notified whenever new episodes become available. If you'd like to listen to back episodes or review the show notes, visit dtkane.com/podcast. D.T. Kane's novels are available for purchase at most major online retailers, or you can purchase directly from his website at www.dtkane.com/books. You can receive a free short story and sign up for D.T. Kane's mailing list at dtkane.com/email-signup. If you'd like to connect, you can find D.T. Kane on Facebook at D.T. Kane Author or Twitter at D.T. Kane Author, or send D.T. Kane an email at dtkane@dtkane.com. See you next week.